I'm going to introduce our speaker today, and I hope you enjoy the speech. So, he has been teaching English as a second language at Cégep Édouard-Montpetit since 1998, where he also taught Spanish for 10 years, and where he teaches English linguistics, covering such topics as bilingualism and multilingualism, code switching, language contact, language laws, and second language education. He holds a master's in second language education from McGill University and wrote a guide for parents entitled What to Expect When You're Expecting Your Child to Grow Up Multilingual in Montreal, unpublished. Let's give a warm hand of applause for Alan Hall.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So I've been thinking about this presentation for weeks and weeks and months, and I had a plan, and I changed my plan last night, but I'll tell you why. I wanted to get to, at the end, to how Montreal is a terrific place to bring up kids multilingual, and I wanted to start by acknowledging that there are tensions in Montreal and tensions in Quebec between the English and the French, with immigrants, against immigrants, and so on. And when I practiced the presentation, I realized, oh my God, I could go on and on and on and on about all these conflicts and the history of conflict, but I might not get to the best part, which is the part at the end. So you know, sometimes when there's a delicious dessert and you just decide, let's eat the dessert first, that's what I want to do. I want to start by saying that Montreal is a great place to bring up kids multilingual. And I'll start with that. You probably know that in Quebec, kids have to go to the public school in French, unless their parents are entitled to go because one of the parents studied in English in Quebec. So that's an opportunity for kids to learn French. They have to go to school in French for the primary system and for the secondary system. When I tell this to people from other countries, they often look at me and they say, oh, that's not fair. Why can't they study in English? And I say, okay, well, you're Colombian. What languages do they offer in Colombia? Oh, only Spanish. Okay, right. Oh, you're American. What languages do they offer in the United States? Only English. Okay, well, the guy from California told me about opportunities to learn Spanish too. Spanish classes or dual language, which is really interesting. But generally, in other countries, it's the same story. Primary school and secondary school is in one language. But I want to jump to the end. Oh, sorry, that's not where I should have gone to. Oh yeah, this is good. Okay. Multilingual, let's do this thing. I want to start off with a dessert and with the optimistic conclusion. It's a great place to bring up kids because they're going to go to school in French. If they're entitled to go to school in English, they're going to study French as well, or maybe be an immersion and study 50-50. That's what my son does. He's in the English sector, and he started off in grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 3 doing half of his subjects in English, half of them in French. For the first couple of years, he studied math and science in French, for example, and then for the next couple of years, he studied math and science in French. So he started in French for a couple of years, and then he switched to English for a couple of years. So not only is he learning French, but he's learning subjects in French, and he's learning subjects in English, and he comes out of it completely bilingual. When I talk about bringing up kids multilingual, a lot of people say you must bring them up with one person, one language system. And in families, just like in societies, families have language policies. Sometimes they're explicit and well thought out, and sometimes they just happen. But a lot of families decide to go the one person, one language route, OPO. And that's what I did in my family. I speak English with my son at home, and my wife speaks Spanish with my son at home. We speak Spanish all together sometimes, but basically my son and I, it's always in English. My wife and I, it's always my wife and my son, it's always in Spanish. And he does all kinds of activities outside in French. A lot of people swear by this is the best way. You should teach your native tongue to your child. But it's not the only way. And if you're in Montreal or in a number of contexts, you might consider other language policies for your family. So I'm going to number 3 or 4 of them. Another system could be one language in the house and another language or two, or a couple of languages in the house, and then another language outside of the house. And this is especially recommended. One of the languages, sorry, I'm going in and out. This is especially recommended if one of the languages is at risk, and if it's not so common in society. So let's say you speak Romanian, and your spouse speaks Romanian, then it might be an idea to maximize the amount of Romanian they can get at home, knowing that they're going to get French outside, knowing that they're going to get English outside. They can grow up with several languages. Doesn't have to be one person, one language. And by the way, people insist that you must speak your native tongue to your child. I would tend to agree, but in some circumstances, perhaps if I were living in Toronto, which is where perhaps if I were living in Toronto, I would speak French to my kid sometimes because I can and because it would help him to learn French. Another strategy is speaking a certain language, let's say just at meal times, or just on the weekends, or in the summer for several weeks in a row. I also heard someone on YouTube saying that they spoke one language in the morning and one language in the afternoon. No, alternate days, speaking one language to their child on one day and speaking another language on another day. I don't think I could go for that, but there's a case to be made for trying to get your kid to practice another language, let's say on weekends, and really making an effort to speak on Saturdays and Sundays language, because it doesn't get as much time out there as other languages do. There's also the system of language at any time, but it's not recommended by linguists because children need to know that there's a boundary between English and French, for example, and other languages. And if people are speaking any language anytime, it's not the best way for a child to learn one language or two languages or three. It's probably better for them to learn one at a time. Maybe you saw the article about Sabrina, or in which Sabrina was mentioned. She was up here, one of the organizers. And she was quoted in the article as having grown up in a unilingual family where they only spoke French. And when she was around 15, she picked up English. And she's picked up a number of languages since. And it's quite common for people to do that, to pick up one language first, or one or two at home, or maybe even one or two or three at home. But when you go to school, here's another language, and at different points in your life, other languages come into play. A couple of comments I do have about bringing up a child to learn several languages is you might have a plan, and you might think you know what's the best plan, but the person you're living with and also bringing up the child with might not have the same ideas for a number of reasons. And even if they're already multilingual, and even if they already speak certain languages, it doesn't mean they're going to teach them to your child, or it doesn't mean they will want to, for a number of reasons. Maybe they feel they're busy and they have other priorities. Maybe they associate their own first language with racism, or with being poor, or maybe they've been discriminated against in some other context. I've even had students tell me that one of their languages is ugly, they don't like it, and people look at them funny when they speak their language. So there's no guarantee that people are going to necessarily all have the same ideas about which languages they should teach and which languages they're proud of. And people might have a trauma about a certain language. People might feel that they've moved to Canada and English is the language of opportunity, or French and English are the languages of opportunity, so they're not interested in certain languages, and they may or may not be enthusiastic about sharing them. I mentioned that if you go to public school, primary school or secondary school here in Quebec, that it has to be in French, unless you're eligible to go in English. However, the daycares, they're not covered by language policy. So in my case, my son went to daycare in French, and I considered that a great opportunity for him to get French immersion at the age of 3 or 4. And I would say as a result, even though I've studied French for years and years and years, he has a better accent than I do already. He's only 12 now, 13, just turned 13. He has a better accent than I do already. And he got a good grasp of French at a very young age. In other daycares, children will meet other children who speak other languages, and it could be an opportunity to learn other languages. And it's a change in a child's life where he or she will be exposed to other languages. Also, the Cégep system, which is where I teach, comes after high school, after secondary school, and people have the choice to go to an English Cégep or a French Cégep. It's not covered by language laws. And a lot of francophones or a lot of immigrants will go to school in French and choose the English Cégep system. And it's a chance for them to have a kind of English immersion. And more Anglophones are studying in English and then going to French Cégeps or university in French. And another thing people don't know, perhaps, about Quebec is that Bill 101 was passed, or the Charter of the French Language. They also introduced what's called PELO. And PELO is the equivalent of language classes. And a lot of people know that in Canada, you can put your kid in heritage language classes. And you can do the same thing here in Quebec. So PELO means Programme d'enseignement des langues d'origine. So let's say your first language is Italian. Your child will have to study in French normally in the Quebec system. But if there are enough students in a school, like usually in a primary school, then if there are 15 students who are interested in a school, the government will pay for them to have Italian classes. And I'll just show you a bunch of the languages that are on offer for people who ask for it. So this is a document I posted on my PowerPoint, and you can find it and click on it if you like. Once I post it, okay, I think it's better. But there's a little explanation of these classes, and it's 45 hours in a semester, just like a normal English or French class. And teachers will teach Arabic, or Portuguese, or Mandarin, or Tamil, or Urdu, Bengali, Haitian Creole, Spanish, Tagalog, Vietnamese, or any other language that's requested. So it just takes a parent or two to say, okay, we have 15 kids, why don't we have some classes in another language? And the government will go about looking into it. And they'll provide a teacher and provide classes in these heritage languages. A couple of interesting facts. I phoned someone a few years ago and talked to them about this, who works there. And they said that about half of all the classes are Italian classes. So the Italians are big into this. They've looked into this, and about half of the students who are in these heritage classes are studying Italian. Another interesting fact is that you don't have to speak that language as a heritage language. You could also just request to attend the class. So, but you can't be more than a third of the students. So you could have 15 students who are Italian speaking, and you could have a handful of other students who are not Italian speaking but who are interested. And that's more and more the case, that people are interested in attending Spanish classes, even if they're not Hispanic. So they're allowed to do so, provided their numbers don't start to compete with the actual mother tongue speakers. Oh yeah, another interesting fact is that there are 3 schools in the neighborhood where I come from, or where I live rather, at Plateau, Mile End. There are 3 schools that have been teaching these classes in Spanish for the last 20 years consecutively, nonstop. So this has been big for 20 years straight. They're always teaching these heritage classes. I'd also like to recommend a few resources here in Montreal. And one is La Grande Bibliothèque. La Grande Bibliothèque, translated, it's the big library. It sounds more grandiose in French, yeah. And I'll show you something interesting about La Grande Bibliothèque. As you can see on this page, I'll open it up, sorry. As you can see on this page, there are books available in a number of languages, including German, Arabic, Chinese, Creole, Spanish, Greek, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, and Vietnamese. These are books that parents can take out, but even more interesting perhaps is that they have a collection just for kids of books in Arabic, books in Chinese, books in Creole, Spanish, and Romanian. So you click here and you can get a list of the books that are available in those languages. That's La Grande Bibliothèque. Anybody can go there and borrow books. Anybody can just go and look at the books and so on. And here is from Montreal, City of Montreal Library System, Bibliothèque Montréal. And as you'll see here, maybe I'll make it a little bigger. You can search for books in a number of languages. Check this out: French, English, German, Arabic, Bengali, Chinese, Creole, Spanish, Greek, Gujarati, Hindi, Italian, Japanese, Dutch, Urdu, Punjabi, Portuguese, Russian, Tagalog, Tamil, Vietnamese. Now typically, certain libraries will have collections of certain languages. So in a neighborhood called Park X, which is just straight north, 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 there will be more Indian-related languages. And in the area where we're going to go for the Brazilian dinner, if you're going, it's very Latino. There's Italian resources and so on, and Latin American and a bunch of languages associated with certain neighborhoods. So if you go to the libraries in those certain neighborhoods, you'll find big collections of specific languages. But if I want to book in any language at all, I can look for it and I can have it sent to my local library and it will be sent there. So these are some resources available in Multilingual Montreal. In addition to reading books yourself and getting books for your kids, they also have storytelling activities. So you can sign up for a newsletter and you can find out that they're going to be telling stories in Vietnamese on Friday at a particular library, or they're going to be telling stories in Spanish. And I would encourage people to go to the libraries if you live here and request materials in the language you want, perhaps volunteer to tell stories in the language you want, and to take your kids to those kind of activities. As a teacher, I have a special technique I'd like to, and I first heard about this from my professor at McGill, and he introduced a program where the first would read a book, they'd read chapter 1 to the students, and then the next day the students would go to their English class, and the English teacher would say, "So what happened in that book? Tell me about it." And the kids would start to talk about it, and they had to look for the correct language to express themselves in English, having heard it in French. And sometimes they would translate things wrong, and the teacher would say, "Oh, don't you mean?" And the teacher would insist on the correct words in English. And then the teacher would read chapter 2 with them. And then they'd go back to French class the next day, and the French teacher would say, "OK, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé dans l'histoire? Racontez-moi." And the kids would have to tell the story to the French teacher. And in this way, they were reading the same book, and they had to speak about it in English, and they had to speak about it in French. And they were read to in the two languages. Professor Lister recommended certain authors, like Tommy Ungerer. And I've read to my son using books like Le Petit Prince, which is available in many languages. You can read a chapter in French, you can read a chapter in English. The Grimm brothers, it's available in several languages. And you can take these authors and you can search for them in the Montreal public libraries, and you can find out that they have books in English and then they have books in German and so on and so forth. Two good things about this technique. Of course, reading books expands the child's vocabulary. Avoid what's called domain-specific language. I said before, maybe on a Saturday you might want to concentrate on speaking a certain language with your kids, but it might turn out that their Spanish is basically kitchen Spanish. It's all about tortillas and burritos, and it doesn't get beyond that. When you read books, it greatly expands your vocabulary. And I can't insist enough on that. Even if you watch a movie version of a book, it has less vocabulary than the book does. Some studies have shown that books have richer vocabulary. Even the same book made into a movie doesn't have as rich vocabulary. Here are some tips I have from books I read on raising children and from my own experience. If you really want your kid to speak a certain language, let's say this is the third language or fourth language, let's say this is not a language that's spoken every day in Montreal on the streets, you have to make the language necessary. So obviously, people will think, okay, travel to a country where they're going to speak with their relatives. These days, you can Skype with someone in another country, of course. We use this with our son. My wife wanted him to speak with family in Colombia, so she said, why don't you ask your cousin if she can help you with your math homework? So he had to explain his math homework, which he's done in French and English, and explain it to the cousin in Spanish, and he got some feedback in Spanish, right? And some practice speaking Spanish. And of course, then you could start gossiping about everyone else in the family. Of course, you can invite people over to your house and try and encourage the kids to interact, but it doesn't necessarily work the way you think. We have some friends who are Colombian, and you invite the kids over and you expect they'll speak Spanish, and guess what? They play in French because they're all used to going to school in French, and they'll speak in French together a certain amount. Then they'll come into the house and speak Spanish with the parents, and my son will speak English with me, for example. So they'll use a bunch of languages, not necessarily the ones you intended and at the time you intended, But of course, if you invite people over who speak certain languages, there's a good chance that kids will interact with them. Earlier on, one of the organizers code switched. He couldn't remember how to say schedule in English. He was like, okay, or no, sondage. Couldn't remember how to say sondage in English. And sometimes people obsess over code switching and they think it's a bad thing. In Montreal, we do it all the time. If I can't think of how to say a survey, I'll say sondage. Or someone else might say survey. Necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily laziness. But if you know someone speaks a couple of languages, you can use words from language. And I just like to say to people, don't be obsessive about code switching. It doesn't mean people are not learning one of the languages, even if they switch to another language or use a word from another language. Don't be obsessed. Ce n'est pas grave. Another tip, I've talked to several parents who used to speak German to their kids, and at some point they kind of gave up. Or people who speak Portuguese with their children, and at some point they kind of gave up. Usually because their language has less status in our society, because English and French are much more common. So a couple of pieces of advice here. Don't give up on your language or don't give up on your languages. If you value teaching those languages, keep speaking the language. You can expect your child might come home tired one day and might not want to speak in that language. There might be resistance or fatigue, but a parent or a caregiver can continue to speak in the language. Even more, in the case of my wife, she just refuses to speak to my son if he doesn't speak to her in Spanish. She says, "A mí me hablas en español." And she insists on him speaking Spanish, not just listening to her in Spanish, but speaking Spanish. And interestingly, when he was very young, we went to the doctor, and the doctor said, if you want him to speak Spanish, you should insist he speaks Spanish to you. It's not just enough for him to listen to you and understand. Make him speak Spanish. I'm not saying you have to do that or you should do that, but it's one strategy, and it's worked for us. So if he's talking and she doesn't, if he's not speaking in Spanish, my wife will just totally ignore him. It's like another language from another planet. Also, some people worry that, for example, French is not my first language. I shouldn't speak French with my kid. My son or my child is going to learn bad French because of my bad accent. I would say you don't have to speak a language perfectly to help a child to learn it. Of course, it's better if a child is exposed to native speakers of French, native speakers of English, native speakers of different languages. But people can still help children. They can read books to them. They can help them with vocabulary. And I would say, in fact, you're modeling open-mindedness. You're modeling effort. So, for example, I read to my son in French quite often, especially if we go abroad. We go to Colombia, and I think he's not going to hear French for a while, so I read books to him in French. And he says, what does that mean? And I tell him what it means. Another word, doesn't know what it means. I can tell him what it means. I've already said his accent is better than mine, but he can still understand what I'm saying in French. And I think it's valuable to be able to help people, even if you don't speak the language perfectly. It doesn't have to be your first language. Also, bringing up children, it's not realistic to think, okay, I'm going to bring up my child to speak 5 languages perfectly, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of linguists. Trilingual is realistic. According to Agathe Tupula-Kabola, I forgot to make a shout out to her, but she's going to be speaking later. She's going to do a presentation in French. And there was a video clip in which she says, a child needs to spend about 1/3 of his or her time speaking a language to master it. So it's not just enough to turn on the TV in English, she said. They're not going to learn English that way. They need to interact with people. They need to practice whatever the language is. And you might start off thinking, I'm going to bring up my child to speak 3 languages or 5 languages. And I would suggest be flexible. Things might not turn out as you expected. I wanted to bring up my child to speak 3 languages perfectly. And after a while, I said, okay, maybe that's not realistic. He has a good French accent. He interacts in French. He defends himself and speaks very well in Spanish. But little by little, English has taken over in our particular situation. And perhaps if we were in another country, another language might take over. I don't know. But you can expect that things change. if you go from one context to another. Remember that each child, even in the same family, will have his trajectory and language repertoire. So what do I mean by that? By trajectory, for example, a girl who was born into a family where 2 boys already speak English, she'll learn English really quickly, perhaps, compared to the first 2 who learned it more slowly. And because of friends and because of circumstances, you interact with different people at different times for different amounts of time. And even in the same family, you don't have the same outcome. A tip, before I go back to the rest of the presentation. A tip here, ask for related gifts and give language-related gifts to people in your family. Give them books, children's books, board games. You can play Monopoly, for example, in any number of languages or any other number of board games you like. Give people DVDs, ask for presents like that. Here in Montreal, there's a bookstore called Michel Fortin on Saint-Denis Street, and it has books in a number of languages. Sometimes you can get bilingual books too. Half the pages in Spanish, half the pages in French. That can be fun for people who want to practice a language but are not 100% there yet. There's a whole bunch of associations and bookstores in Montreal, and I can't list them all off, but there's the Goethe Institute, which has a bunch of resources in German. There's a Friendship Center, which is for people located on Saint Laurent, I believe. And there are a number of bookstores. There's an Italian bookstore in Little Italy. There are Spanish bookstores, Portuguese newspapers, and so on. So those are a whole bunch of resources. Now I'll go back to the beginning here. Oh, sorry, not like that. Yeah, I'll go back to the beginning. So here I am giving a presentation to polyglots, a whole number of languages, and people who are enthusiastic about it. And sometimes people are impressed in Montreal. They hear conversations switching back between English and French. And it is a great place to learn 2 languages and more. And as I've said, there's a whole bunch of resources, there's official support to practice other languages. But there are also people with some ideas. Not everybody thinks bilingualism is beautiful. So here's an example of an article in a newspaper called La bilinguisation rampant, rampant bilingualism. This is from a respected newspaper, and they often have articles about the place of English becoming too strong here in Montreal. Language laws are not respected enough. English is seen more and more on the signs. It's not supposed to be on the signs outside. And this author is particularly concerned with what's called institutional bilingualism. In fact, I've read other articles by him in which he said that his son is in enriched English, and he thinks it's important for his son. And this is very common in Quebec, that people think individually bilingualism is important and languages are important, but they don't want to open the door to everything being bilingual. There's an argument made, and I think it makes sense, that if everybody could speak English here, then why would people want to learn French? Okay, I was going to say that's not going to sound good, but someone's nodding his head. I think there's some truth to that. If everybody could speak English and everybody could be served in English, people might say, okay, why would I need to learn French? It's less important, it's not as powerful, it's not spoken in as many places. This particular article takes issue with the Cégeps, in which Collège Vanier, an English-speaking Cégep, and Cégep Saint Laurent decided they wanted to have bilingual programs. So, French Cégep, you can take a couple of courses in English. English Cégep, you can take a couple of courses in French. Seems like a good idea to me. Seems like a good idea to a lot of students, but some people think, let's not go there. That's in the news. Here's an article in the same newspaper from a couple of weeks ago, and it's about Valérie Plante. Valérie Plante is the mayor of Montreal. Now, first of all, the picture says 1,000 words. So behind her is a flag of Canada and not a flag of Quebec. So the person who wrote the article took issue with that. She's the mayor of Montreal. Where's the Quebec flag? Also, she begins a lot of her speeches by saying we are on unsurrendered Mohawk territory. People at the city of Montreal have begun speeches like that. And the author says, why are you trying to divide society? The flag in the background also is the flag of Montreal. which used to have 4 symbols to represent the French settlers, the Scottish settlers, the Irish settlers, and the English. And now the flag has, in the very middle, which I think it should have, the Tree of Peace, which represents the First Nations people. So there's a lot of symbolism in this particular photo. She's also hanging with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. And another thing she's criticized about is that apparently she gives a lot of speeches and interventions in both English and French. And the author says, this is Montreal, why don't you promote the French language? Why are you doing everything bilingual? And it kind of gets back to what I said before. If everybody can speak English and be served in English, maybe they won't make the effort to learn French. Now here's an article in the Gazette, an English language newspaper, and it says, Montreal is a shining beacon of bilingualism, according to the census of 2011. So we collect a lot of statistics here in Canada on what language people speak, or what languages, and what language they speak at home. And the Gazette is very optimistic about bilingualism. When the language laws first came in, insisting people had to use French and learn French, the Gazette was not as enthusiastic about it. But now that it's a fact, that French is a fact, the Gazette is a big supporter of bilingualism. However, in this little subtitle here, they get in a little dig. Anglophones in Montreal are very lucky. McGill University's Fred Genesee, and he's a psychologist who's done a lot of great research on bilingualism, one of the experts on bilingualism, but he adds that Francophone parents do not have the same choices. In the context of the Gazette, this can be seen to be a bit of a dig at existing language laws, because Anglophones can study bilingually and Francophones cannot, and immigrants cannot. So that's a bit of a dig. And in various contexts, people will criticize language laws and say perhaps they're outdated, perhaps we should weaken the language laws. Some people would like to strengthen them, some people would like to weaken them. Here's some other discourse that unfortunately is very common these days, especially since we have an election in about 30 or 40 days. You see how the left in Denmark is turning its back on immigration. Danish are so open, and they're turning their back. Maybe Canadians should be doing the same. I think that might imply. And we'll see here about massive immigration. We hear this periodically, that there's massive immigration and this is problematic. So this is basically immigrant as problem and multilingualism as problem. And I referred to this book. It tells you something when you see a book like this on a shelf, as I did, and you go, wow, this is a book promoting bilingualism here in Quebec. And it's supportive of bilingualism and it thinks it's a good thing. So when I saw this book, I thought, oh, that's positive, that's interesting, and it's a little bit unusual. So I'm going to go now to a whole bunch of history of language policy in Canada and Quebec. And I'm going to go way back to the initial inhabitants of this land around us. And when Jacques Cartier first came to Canada from France in 1534, his first stop was Gaspé, and he came here in search of trade, and his first act, after talking to some Micmac, was to plant a cross, and when he left, he brought 2 of the Iroquois sons back to Europe with him, to show them in Europe as a specimen. And he came back with them a few years later, a year later. On a second voyage, he came back with the 2 sons, and in his journals, he described the village of Hochelaga. Maybe you've heard of a movie called Hochelaga, or maybe you've heard that Hochelaga is the origins of Montreal. And I tried to look for more and more information, and it seemed to be a little bit contradictory. The official version is that Hochelaga is at the base of present-day Montreal, or perhaps in old Montreal, and that Cartier walked up the mountain with Donnacona, and he planted a cross there also, but we're not exactly sure if it's Mount Royal or if it's somewhere else. But this is initial contact between the French and First Nations. The Five Nations Confederacy already existed at that time, And I wanted to try and find out how different nations communicated with each other in terms of language policy or just language. One thing that's interesting is that there were these 5 nations, and they all spoke languages related to Iroquois or Iroquoian languages, including the Mohawks. When Samuel de Champlain arrived in 1603, there was no more sign of Hochelaga. And Hochelaga, by the way, I said was described by Jacques Cartier, and it was said to have 50 families living in a longhouse. There were fields of corn, there were smoked fish, and there was some kind of a settlement there, but it seemed to be gone in 1603. The French, as they started populating what's now Montreal, they made allies with the Hurons, who are traditional enemies of the Iroquois nations. And the Mohawks, who live close to here and around here, also of the Iroquois Confederacy, they were therefore enemies of the Hurons and therefore enemies of the French. So the French began to populate what is now Montreal, while the Mohawks were trading with the Dutch and the English. And this might explain why many years later it's still common to meet Mohawks who prefer to speak English rather than French. They've been, they're affected by the history of working with the English, but more and more Mohawks are trilingual with English, French, and Mohawk. In 1760, the British defeated the French in a battle on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City, and New France was surrendered. But in the 1700s, the French continued to colonize, and so did the English. 1763, there was the Royal Proclamation Act by King George III of England, recognizing the First Nations people here in Quebec, recognizing that they exist. However, later on, we will hear that there were policies aiming more to assimilate the Indians, as they were called. They were offered to give up their status on the reserves in exchange for land and the right to vote. In 1876, the Indian Act was passed, and children were actually taken off the reserves and brought to residential schools, and they were forced to study in French or forced to study in English in schools that were basically run by the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church. So the policy was forced assimilation. So this explains why a whole generation or two of children don't speak their native tongue. The Constitution Act, or the BNA Act of 1867, followed the Lower Canada Rebellion. This is an example of a conflict in Quebec here, in which there were insurrections in 1837 and 1838, known as Les Patriotes, rebelling against English rule. The names Papineau and Chenier and La Fontaine are associated with the rebellions, and also Wilfred Nelson, who was an English speaker and mayor at the time. And the British brought over Lord Durham, who made a famous report saying that maybe we should just assimilate the French people. Two minutes left, okay. Okay, 2 minutes just for the question period? Okay, so I should really stop. And see if people have questions or comments. And if anyone has a question or a comment, they can speak in the mic, please. Okay. If there are no questions, do I have time to say any more, or am I cut off? If no questions, you can 5 minutes left. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I have about 5 more minutes. Sorry for that. And I'd like to say that based on historical tensions and historical conflicts, especially between the English and French, there are still some arguments out there today. So if you're bringing up children and you think they're going to learn English and French and another language, a lot of people like us are enthusiastic about it, but there are still arguments out there And there are people who would like to weaken the pro-French legislation. They say, okay, that legislation has done its piece, but it's time to maybe reconsider. Canada is bilingual after all, for example, is one of the main arguments. Oh, sorry, this is some of the arguments in favor of pro-French legislation. So people will say French is the majority. It's a nation that's accommodating the historic English-speaking minority. The French are struggling to survive in a sea of English. In the 1950s and 1960s, the English dominated in business, and they dominated in the workplace, and the English minority had its day. But it's important that French be protected. It's important that people see French on the signs. It's important that people study in French, or else it's going to get swallowed up. They say French is the assertion of an identity. It's necessary to be maître chez nous, to be in charge of our nation. There was a referendum in 1980 about sovereignty, in which Quebecers almost voted to set up a new nation, sovereign nation. There was another referendum in 1995, also a very close one, and Anglophones jokingly refer to neverendum, because the referendums are so close that there's always a chance that there will be another one around the corner, and they're very divisive affairs. There are pro-English arguments, and I'll do these quickly, and you might say, yeah, that all makes sense. Oops, sorry, go back. People will say English is the language of globalization. English is the lingua franca, and English is one of Canada's two official languages. English is the language of technology, the internet. True, but sometimes the argument is overstated, and the argument, 5 more? The argument is that maybe it's time to weaken language laws because globalization, because everybody speaks English, because Canada's a bilingual country. Oh, and by the way, English is a lingua franca, meaning that people who speak different languages speak in English together. But French is also a lingua franca. People in North Africa can communicate with people from Arabic-speaking countries, and France and Switzerland and so on. So French is also a lingua franca. It's not the case that English is the only lingua franca. It's not the case that English is the only language of technology. So sometimes these arguments are overstated. And sometimes people use arguments. Historically, people have used arguments saying that protecting the French language, it's tribal. Back in the 80s, people said the Berlin Wall has just come down, so why are we dividing people? We should be coming together. People even used arguments about Serbia and Croatia and saying imposing French is like ethnic cleansing. I think they went over the top with that. They said people should be free to choose English or French. Today, the arguments are more subtle. Canada is bilingual, we should have the choice. What about the tourists? What about the tourists coming here from the United States? Do they have to drive around and read in French? Shouldn't they be allowed to read in English? They might have an accident. What about the little old lady when she goes into the subway? Shouldn't she be able to get instructions in English? So people use arguments like this. After the articles that I showed you from the newspapers, people will comment and they'll make arguments that maybe it's time for Montreal to become bilingual. Montreal's international. Montreal should show that it's open for business. Lack of ability in French shouldn't prevent the best from being hired. So people will suggest maybe we should loosen the language laws, let people come here and study in English to get the very best. And some people will say passing a French test is xenophobic, making people pass a French test to become citizens. Other arguments still out there. There are arguments against English. They say English is a threat to the survival of French. So it is in some sense, but it doesn't mean me speaking in English is a threat to the French language right now, I don't think. It doesn't mean me listening to music in English is a threat to the French language, I don't think. I've seen in articles that English is terribly seductive to immigrants and even to speakers of French. Some Francophones, if they had the choice, they would go to school in English. So English is seductive, maybe dangerous. There are the arguments I told you. We have too many immigrants, massive immigration. When Jean Charest tried to instate English immersion within the French school system. He wanted to have students in grade 6 do half of their year in French and then the other half with just English activities. And people said, this sends the wrong message that English is more important than French. No, it doesn't. It just sends the message that English is important, but not more important. Articles appear periodically in the newspaper to say that, okay, Anglophones are speaking French more and more, but they don't listen to our music. They listen to music and watch movies in English. They don't even know who Marie-May is. Do you know who Marie-May is? She's a singer, Quebecois singer. Another argument I hear again and again is that more people are speaking a language other than French at home. And my answer to that is, so what? If I speak another language at home, it doesn't mean I can't also speak French. If people speak Spanish at home, it doesn't mean they can't also speak French. Not necessarily. Time's up. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Now, going back to the models that you described, one is to separate languages by person, by location, by time, or to have everything mixed up. But the limitation of all four models, some argue, is that the children pick up language used in a specific setting or context only in one language. For example, when they go to daycare or kindergarten or even school in, say, French, then as they grow up and become workers, they can only think and work in a subset of the languages. What's your opinion or advice about raising children so that they become professionally fluent or at least somewhat capable in multiple languages for school and for work?
I think I just turned, okay, this is good. Okay, well, I mentioned about reading to children in several languages, like reading the same book in several languages. That's about literacy. And I didn't really speak a lot about reading and writing, but definitely if you can get them into trilingual education, I think that's a good thing. And I didn't talk much about trilingual education. To my knowledge, there are several schools in Montreal that offer trilingual education, but to my knowledge, they're all private schools. So there are Mohawk schools, that's probably public. There are German schools, there are Armenian and Hebrew schools, and there's a new Spanish school. But I would check out the heritage language if you can mobilize for that, to get your kid to read and write in another language, read books in another language and so on, and maybe consider going to another country and doing a sabbatical for a certain amount of time. I have a neighbor who did this. She up and went to Germany for a year and came back, and she said that was a great boost for her child. And I have a friend who's Japanese who goes to Japan frequently. And more we can do that. You can also get help with your math on Skype and things like that, right? I don't know if anyone else has a suggestion, and please pitch in. You can, I think he's going to. You can ask a question.
I'll just shout.
Thanks. It's not really a question. It's more of a comment that sounds silly, but it's actually true. Should anybody, because I really like the idea of keeping French alive in Montreal and Quebec. As an American who crossed the border last night by car, if anybody makes the argument that shouldn't we be able to see signs in English, I could say two things. First of all, as you approach the border, our signs start to be bilingual. There's French and English. And I thought to myself, not really necessary. I mean, Canadians speak English and French is not there in the US, but I thought it was kind of nice to see, why not? So we're actually already prepared when by the time we get to Canada. We've seen sorties and various other signs. And the second one is you have a greater likelihood of having a crash because of the conversion to kilometers per hour than the speed limit. It suddenly started to give me the speed limit in kilometers, and my American car doesn't have kilometers, and I have absolutely no idea what the difference is mathematically. So you could tell even Anglophone Canadians who are arguing that point that actually that's a greater danger than signs being in French. Just a small tip.
Okay, so I've been totally out of time. One last thing, I have some books for show and tell. If you're a teacher, if you're an educator, if you're a parent, if you're interested in Canada's language policy, on that at all, but I have a really interesting book if anyone wants to have a look, discreetly or indiscreetly. I'll leave them on my table and people can come and have a look at any time. So thanks again.